Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme. We're going to discuss something dear to all of our hearts, the planet, and we're going to talk as well about its future and what we should be doing with its future in rather a controversial way. With me to discuss it today is a man named one of the world's most influential people of the 21st century. He's the president of his own think tank. He's author of books The Sceptical Environmentalist and Cool It, and he sets out to challenge mainstream concerns about development and the environment, and he tries to set out different solutions. We're going to be asking shortly then if the Paris Climate Change Agreement is really the right way to tackle global warming. Bjorn Lomborg joins us then from Copenhagen. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. I mean, it really does feel, doesn't it, at the moment, like not a day goes by without another red light warning report. 2 weeks ago, we had a warning report about temperatures rising. Just this week, we've had a report about the levels of pollution. We've also had a report about the number of animals being drastically reduced due to humans. I mean, do you accept that we're getting our care of the planet wrong in the first place?
Well, there's certainly lots of problems. That's undeniably. Global warming is a real problem. There's a problem with biodiversity. There's a huge problem with air pollution. So very clearly, we have a lot of tasks ahead of us. The question that my think tank and I try to focus on is saying, where can we actually have the greatest impact per euro or per dollar spent? Instead of spending lots of money doing almost no good, let's spend lots of dollars doing an enormous amount of good where it'll actually help the most.
So is the Paris Agreement then spending a lot of money and not doing any good?
Unfortunately, the Paris Agreement is a fairly small way of trying to do something about global warming at a very, very high cost. So the Paris Agreement, by its own organizer, the UNFCCC, so the guys who did the Paris Agreement, they estimate that the total impact, if everyone does everything they promised to 2030, will cut 1% of what it'll take us to get to 2 degrees centigrade. So fundamentally, it'll leave 99% of the problem still there. And the cost will be in the order of $1 to $2 trillion a year. So it's a very costly treaty to do very little. What we need to do if we want to fix global warming is to dramatically increase investment in research and development into green energy. If we could make green energy cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone would switch: the Chinese, the Indians, and of course, the Europeans and the Americans.
That sounds easier said than done to me, though.
It does. And in some way, if you noticed on the sidelines of the Paris Agreement, Barack Obama and a lot of other state leaders, together with Bill Gates and many others, actually met to try to promise, well, they did promise to double their investment in research and development into green energy. And the research shows that is a policy response that'll actually help fix global warming. Now, we argue that you should not double it, but increase it sixfold, so get up to about $100 billion. It would be still much cheaper than what we're trying to do with the Paris Agreement, and it would have a much greater chance to actually work.
Is your message getting across, though, do you think? Because, I mean, let's face it, there were obviously hundreds, if not thousands of people who came and were involved in the Paris Agreement, a lot of experts involved in that as well, and they came up with the Paris Agreement. I mean, surely if all the experts are saying that's the way to go, then that's what we should be doing.
Well, we've been trying to make the sort of Paris Agreement approach for the last 20 years. So we started back in 1992, promised to cut carbon emissions and didn't do it by 2000. Then we met in Kyoto, promised in 1998 to cut carbon emissions in 2010. Most countries only just made it, mostly because of the global recession. And so we've been promising for 25 years to do stuff that we don't really live up to. Paris Agreement is just one more step in that approach. I would argue if we failed for the last quarter century, maybe it's time to change track. Now, as you say, lots of people still on the track to say, let's keep doing what we have failed to do in the last 25 years. But I would argue there's a lot of people starting to listen and say, maybe we should do the thing that's both cheaper, much more likely to be effective, and the thing that might actually get us out of the rut where we are in now. And of course, remember, at the same time, there are lots of other challenges. As you mentioned before, we have lots of air pollution. We estimate more than 7 million people die from air pollution, mostly from indoor air pollution. And that is solved by pulling people out of poverty, something we know how to do with a better free trade agreement, but also better education, better opportunities for people in many different ways. So again, let's remember, Global warming is one challenge, and we need to fix that smartly. But we also need to fix a lot of other challenges, and we can only do so if we have bandwidth enough to look across all the areas and say, where can we do smart stuff?
So let's talk about this green energy. I mean, obviously the things that immediately come to mind, I suppose, are wind turbines, solar power, that kind of thing. I mean, why, in what way could they be advanced so that they do become a lot more user-friendly? Because at the moment there are enormous problems with all of those, aren't they?
Well, the fundamental problem with solar and wind is that when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, the cost of energy from those two energy sources is infinite. And so what you need to do is both make the price on average go down, and we've done that very successfully by making the wind turbines bigger, by making the solar panels more effective. But we also need to get much better at doing storage. And then we probably also need to realize that solar and wind is only going to be a part, maybe even only a smaller part of the solution. So we need to look at a lot of other opportunities, obviously fusion and fission. We need to look at, Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000. He's suggesting that we should make algae that produces oil on the ocean surface. That would actually be CO2 neutral oil. There are lots of other proposals out there. And then there's, of course, the whole idea of carbon capture, which a lot of people are talking about, but we have very little technology to deal with right now. There are lots of opportunities. We should fund all of those because research is cheap. And we only need a few of these solutions to come to fruition, and they could be the power sources that will power the 21st century. So this is really about saying, instead of already deciding now what is the right solution, let's focus on what are the smartest ways to get much more funding into research that will enable us to find these solutions that will power the rest of the century.
And finally, what about us at home? You know, obviously, we hear so much, don't we, about companies needing to change the way they're doing things. Is there anything that we can do really quickly to actually make a difference immediately?
I would love to be able to tell you, you can just switch off your lights and then we're all good to go. But global warming, unfortunately, is about cutting 80–90% of our carbon emissions. That's not something you and I can do. It's something that we can change our societies, have more public transport, those kinds of things, but it's much, much more going to be through innovation. If we get technologies that will cut our carbon emissions, we'll do it. If we don't, we're not going to make the solution by urging you and me and everybody else to do small stuff. And in total, a lot of small stuff, unfortunately, just adds up to small stuff.
Bjorn Lomborg, good to talk to you today. Thank you very much for taking time out to talk to us, joining us live there from Copenhagen for today's perspective.